Welcome back to the Canadian Gun Vault Behind the Vault Door. My name is Mark Morelli. I'll be your podcast host. Joining me today is none other than Coach Nick. Coach Nick Anderson, so glad that you're here today.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. You know what? And we've got a lot going on in the news. Got some very sad stuff happening. I don't mean to sound too enthusiastic about it, but there's just so much going on. And certainly the height of today's news has got to be the mass shootings in New Zealand. Obviously, you've heard about what's going on.
Yeah, absolute tragedy.
Okay, horrible. And we'll kick off things by saying that for all the people that had to endure that, for the families of those that have passed, you know, what a horribly tragic event. We here at the Canadian Gun Vault condemn, in no uncertain terms, we condemn completely the actions of anybody that would hurt innocent people like that. I think it's absolutely atrocious. It's inexcusable. Quite frankly, I'm struggling with feelings of wanting to string those guys up by their toes at the police's earliest convenience. I mean, it's just horrible just to think that anybody would think that it's ever okay to do that under any circumstances. And, you know, Coach Nick, your thoughts on that subject?
Just echo what you said. You know, first of all, thoughts and prayers goes out to the families of those affected, obviously. And it's, you know, a loss for words, really. Like, was it 48, 49 people?
Yeah, 50 people.
You know, obviously it was planned. Went in with no remorse, live streamed it. Like that's just,
yeah. You know what? Like, I mean, it's the height of animosity.
Yeah.
I mean, if it wasn't bad,
barbaric.
Yeah, barbaric is a great term. I mean, you know what? The idea that you would commit something that horrible and then think that it would be, you know, even better, you know, in the mind of a madman, and let's call it what it is, folks. This guy would be, you know, and the people involved in this are total asses. You know, to televise it, to put it out on the internet, to wear a GoPro. You know, I've encouraged everybody out there not to share this. Let's not give these guys and you know, I don't
give them the airtime.
Yeah, you know what? And if you're sitting at home right now thinking that perhaps, you know, we're giving them airtime by talking about it, I think that it's an important discussion that has to be had. And I struggled with that this morning, you know, doing posts that relate to this subject. But I think that it's important on a number of different levels. I think that you know, this is certainly the kind of event that the left have been waiting for. You know, they will most definitely use the people and the families that have been victimized, have suffered through violence involving firearms. Those people will be used, you know, as a platform to push, you know, this anti-gun agenda that has been going on for decades. You know, we want to achieve the highest possible level of public safety, and that's something I want to make totally clear here. At the same time, I think that it's really important that the families, the people that have survived events like this, realize that the firearm community, the legal firearm community, is behind you 100% and wants to never see anything like this happen, and we completely decry and denounce any kind of involvement in an activity like this is just deplorable. It's despicable.
And kind of like what you said, when people die in this kind of fashion, there's no way it should be politicized. Yeah. I find that very unethical for whoever, whatever your agenda is, to turn this into a political football or whatever term you want to put on it. Let it go. Like, let the people deal with this tragedy. Don't politicize it. There's no need to politicize this thing. To me, it almost drawing added attention to it that doesn't need to be to further an agenda.
Yeah, and that's the way I see it. Excuse me for a second. And I mean, again, for the people that think that, you know, well, hey, you know, you're talking about it, so you're part of the problem. I would suggest to you that this is a response to what most certainly will come. I know that there's definitely going to be a push now from the left, certainly in Canada historically. Anytime there's been events like these, it's usually followed up with ridiculous gun laws that have zero impact on public safety, and they've used events like these to push, you know, their agendas. And I hate the fact that happens, and I hate the fact that we have to discuss this subject. Most importantly, I hate that it's happened. And I mean, you got New Zealand, you know, involved in this one apparently, and the details are kind of sketchy. We've got a shooter. At least one of the shooters is from Australia, I'm being told, and he's published a manifesto that would lead people to believe that there are, you know, elements of, white supremacy, or I mean, definitely there's a lot of hatred there for the Muslim community and for some immigration policies. At least that was what I took away from a brief glance at some pages of the manifesto that were published by the shooter, is what's being reported. At least at this point, and I question, a lot of what comes through the media these days. Anything that comes through the mainstream media should be subject to a lot of scrutiny.
Put the filter on for sure.
Put the filter on. But yep. I definitely think though that, the fact that they're saying that this is coming directly from the shooter himself, I think we've got to examine it as carefully as possible and get to the root of the problem.
Well, one thing I find odd is it almost seems in certain media outlets that they've already solved the case.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? They've labeled it terrorism. It's terrorism, no question, et cetera, et cetera. However, I look back in the not too distant past, maybe year and a half, on our soil here in Canada. And we've had some unfortunate events happen. And we've been told, don't rush to judgment.
Yeah. There definitely seems to be a double standard. Certainly.
Why are we being told not to rush to judgment and wait to get all the facts, quote unquote, facts in air quotes, in one situation, but in a situation like this, we're being told, oh, it's terrorism for sure. It's being, like I say, it almost seems like it's being solved, case closed. I don't understand the discrepancy here.
Well, at the risk of being, ultimately called some form of right-wing media outlet, I would suggest to you that I think that you're talking about the mosque shooting that happened in Quebec.
Various. Yeah, that's one of them.
That's just one example. And I'll focus in on that for a second. I can't help but notice that there was a media blackout on that, and almost immediately after it happened, we got, a lot of conflicting information about, who was involved, how it was handled, and the details, seemed to disappear. Almost instantaneously following that event, and we never heard anything about it again. And yet, this event, I have my suspicions that during this event, it's going to be different. We're going to hear all about the gory details. We're going to hear all about, the shooter and what his motivations were, and they're going to dig up every last little piece and make it public knowledge. That's what I see coming. And you know what? You call it whatever you want. There are going to be there's going to be a large discrepancy between.
It does seem like there are a lot of quote unquote facts that have already been, or pieces of information, that have been established and deemed as facts real quick.
Yeah, and isn't that troubling? It
is.
Because we've already got, a little bit of mistrust going on with the media outlets. Certainly, we've got $600 million floating around in the background, being doled out to whoever the government decides to send it out to, and it makes you question a lot of things about perhaps the credibility of some of the sources and the media outlets that receive that money. So again, I would suggest that everybody take what they see and read with a grain of salt.
Do your due diligence like anything else. Don't look at one source. Compare information across sources.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of misinformation, I'm sure, out there. Again, I did watch the video. It was horrific. There were people begging for their lives. There was somebody that, was crying out help, and it was difficult to watch. I've seen a lot of things in my 20 years of policing, and certainly I've seen a lot of horrible behavior from human beings. It was tough to watch. I would discourage anybody from watching it unless you're prepared to see things you won't be able to unsee. And there's a lot of desensitized people out there. I don't think that this is one of those items that you would have to see. Take my word for it, folks. It's horrible. It never needs to happen again. We need to do everything imaginable to stop this sort of thing from happening around the world. Globally. Do I think that the kind of proposals they're making in Canada would have any impact on an event like this? No, I don't. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this kind of begs the question as well, not necessarily something that we have to hash out here, but maybe just for people's personal reflection after they listen to this is would it have made a difference if New Zealand didn't have any guns or there were no guns at all? It kind of seems to me that when you go to the effort of planning this out to the extent that this person did or these people did, when you have a 75-page manifesto and you buy a GoPro to go online and do all the things that they did pre during, and post, that tells me that you're bound and determined, regardless of the means to which you carry out this disgusting act. It kind of I get the impression that it would have happened regardless.
Yeah, you know what? I think that
unfortunately,
it's important. I think that people understand that criminals will always be able to get their hands on guns. The argument is how easily they can get their hands on guns. Here in Canada, we have a very strict set of regulations. We have among the world's strongest and most strict gun laws, and they're already in place. The suggested proposals also include, enhanced background checks, and there's a number of different things. Oh, that's Phil. I'm going to have to call you later, Phil.
Phil, you always call when we're doing a podcast.
Phil, I thought it was going to be Sammy for a second, but it looks like it was Phil. Phil, I'll call you back,
Sam,
I promise.
10 minutes, Sam.
Yeah, you know what? It's going to take us at least that long to get through this subject. But, it's important to know that people will always be able to find a way to harm others. And this is about mindsets. This is about, a completely bent mind. Like what kind of twisted sense of value you would have for human life to commit acts like this. And
there is no value for human life.
Yeah,
clearly.
Yeah. And the ability to get your hands on firearms, your ability to get hands on anything. I mean, I understand that the UK is looking to crack down even more on their knife laws. I mean, like they're
going to embed them with the GPS tracker and fingerprint scanners and
there was some suggestion that they would put GPS tracking devices on every knife. Not that I think that would be possible, but even if it were, technology being what it is, you would probably have about 40 million units in a compressed area like London. I mean, how would you possibly control?
I'm sure
that?
Somebody will hack it.
Right? I mean, it's ridiculous. But more importantly, let's get to the root of the problem. What causes this? What causes someone to become so unplugged from reality, and that they would engage in this kind of activity? That they would plan out this kind of activity. I'd be
in the detail that they did.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to know about this person's background and whether or not they obtain these firearms legally and legitimately. New Zealand's gun laws being what they are, I'm curious to know where the guns came from, and to get a reliable kind of source of information to determine where those things how they arrived in their hands. But you're always going to have people that are going to want to get their hands on guns. They do exist out there. If you eliminated all the legal guns in Canada tomorrow, those guns, there would still be a lot of guns in circulation. And I've oftentimes said this, that bans fuel, and to
the black
everybody,
market would still be there.
Well, it's not that it would just still be there. If you had a fixed number of guns in the black market right now, and it totaled, a million guns, if you had the fixed number of 1 million guns circulating in illegal hands, and you suddenly decided you were going to ban a bunch of non-restricted firearms. And I really want to point this out to people like Billy Blair and to Mark Holland and to Justin Trudeau and to Wendy Cukier and anybody that would push the anti-gun message and agenda, that if you banned these guns tomorrow, you would be fueling the black market in such an enormous way, right, that these guns would flood into the hands of criminals and potentially worse, and that you would be responsible for these guns ending up in the wrong places and potentially placed into situations where people would get hurt. And I want to remind people of that. And I think that it's something that isn't talked about enough. We talk about bans and combating bans and whether or not it's a good idea, to have bans, what have you. I tell you right now, I don't think that enough conversation and dialogue is occurring relating to how that might fuel a black market, and how that might suddenly place those guns into the wrong hands, and who would be responsible for that if that took place.
You know what it boils down to? Is it the pencil's fault that a mistake is made on a piece of paper?
No, of course. Well, it's
not the pencil's fault.
No, you know what? A firearm's a tool. In my time as a police officer, I saw more people stabbed and hit with blunt objects, and ultimately, I never blamed the bat. I never blamed the knife. I never blamed the frying pan for what had happened when somebody decided to lash out violently in a physical way and injure another human being. I never blamed the item, and yet firearms have have this very special place, in our culture and in politics more specifically, where they're treated differently. And it's because of the stigma attached to them. It's because of the mystique attached to them and the ignorance surrounding their use and their legal ownership. They're, in my opinion, they're no different than cars. I see so many people using cars.
Blame the car for somebody drunk driving who killed somebody. It's the car's fault now.
Or taking the car away from the hands of somebody that is commuting to work every day because somebody else has stolen one and run over an innocent person on the other end of the country. Like, I mean, it's totally illogical. Like, to the idea that you would take something away from a good person that uses it peacefully because somebody decided that they were going to abuse, the operation of a machine is ridiculous. And I think that the politicians know that. I think that deep down they know that there really isn't any merit in taking guns away from good people. We trust good people with guns, like police officers, to take care of us. Why wouldn't we trust good people?
It's about rights, responsibilities, and privilege. Having the privilege to do so. We have the right to attempt to attain our license, which is a privilege that we must be responsible enough to maintain.
Yes. And I've often said that if they don't trust us, then that means they don't trust the process by which they select people to be responsible enough to own firearms. And I've often said that if you can't trust us, and I mean, after all the hoops that we jump through and all the screening and background checks that, you subject us to, then there's a problem with your screening process. And in some part, I don't disagree completely with the idea. Like, I have no problems with intense background checks and screening and regulation, and a lot of people would fault me for that and saying some of our American listeners would sit there and say it's a God-given right to have guns, and that may or may not be true.
But that's part of their history.
That's part of their history, and that's part of their culture.
Yeah, and it's not the same way here in Canada.
No. And I really want to remind Canadians of that, is that, guns are a pretty seriously regulated item here in Canada. In the U.S., things are certainly different. They have a different culture, different background, different history in some respects. Here in Canada, we've taken a much softer approach as it relates to firearm ownership and licensing. But at the same time, though, it's a very strict one. And it's something that not everybody, should have access to. Firearms are the type of thing that, like a car, if abused, can be very dangerous. And I think that, for the most part, people operate motor vehicles quite safely and responsibly and are willing to, be subjected to penalty if they should, abuse that, that right to drive a car around. Firearms are no different.
No, they're not. And I would think, and maybe I'm wrong, I guess I just don't know, is that the general public...
You're wrong. I'm just going to go with you're wrong.
The general public, I would think, would find some sort of comfort, for lack of a better phrase, in knowing that legal gun owners in Canada run through the RCMP system every single day.
Yeah. A lot of people...
Every single day.
If I had a nickel for every person that thought that legally owning a firearm in Canada meant that you could tuck a loaded gun in the back of your pants, and that that's what it meant to be a gun owner, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Like the idea that people are still operating under that misconception that we are like the United States, which we are not.
No. So we're checked up on every day, but what about that person who's a habitual drunk driver or habitual speeder? They're not checked up on every day, other than the fact that if they draw the short straw and get stopped for speeding or drunk driving.
Yeah.
And they're committing an offense.
Yeah.
We're not even committing an offense, and our names are going through it.
Yeah,
which is fine. Hey, that's fine. If that's part and parcel of me having the privilege to keep my firearms and enjoy my firearms legally and safely, no problem. But let's talk about some of these other things, and those are two examples.
That's the trade-off, and I don't think a lot of people understand that. As a citizen in this country, you have a legal right to not have a law enforcement officer delve into your background without reasonable excuse. It's a very serious thing. Just like taking property from people is a very serious thing. I don't think people understand that a police officer relieving you of your private property is a very serious thing, and they have to be able to justify it, and they have to be able to continuously justify it through various forms that have to be filled out in order to retain that property that's seized. So we got to take these things very seriously. If somebody is going to be checking into my life every single day, all right, and delving into my background, there really should be some legal reasoning for it. You're right. It's the trade-off. If you want to be able to own and legally operate firearms in this country, you have to be willing to subject yourself to that check and certain treatment. As a result, I think that in a lot of ways, the public is completely unaware of what firearm owners have to go through in order to achieve getting their license and in order to maintain their license. You can't be out there causing trouble.
And I think any gun owner that you or I know, and you know probably about 150 times more gun owners than I do.
I know a couple.
I think you'd probably agree with me when I say 99.5% of those people, if asked by an auntie to have a respectful conversation, explain to them the process, they would have no problem doing so.
Yeah, I've met a lot of people over the years that own firearms. I've met, it's a wonderfully diverse community.
Not from a standpoint of trying to change minds necessarily, from a standpoint of educating in terms of what is the process, what is it all about.
Yeah, well, that's in part why I created the Canadian Gun Vault.
Yeah.
I wanted to educate the public. I wanted to create an entertainment platform that people could kind of gravitate to, learn about firearms, enjoy firearms, and not just firearms of a specific type or a particular activity involving firearms. I wanted it to be for everybody, and I wanted to kind of make it digestible so that most people could walk into it and learn a little something new, maybe have a better appreciation for what firearm owners love about firearms and how safe an activity it is, and to allow the public to kind of see what it is that we really do enjoy about this and why we're fighting for it with such enthusiasm, to retain that right to continue to own firearms. A privilege. A lot of people would get on me for that. It's a privilege. It's a privilege. I don't think that I disagree with the idea of it being a privilege, like a driver's license. I think that if you demonstrate, I think everybody should have the right to make the application to get a license. I think if your behavior is such that you can't be trusted to own and operate a firearm, then you should be denied that possibility.
And the interesting thing is as you know, some of the people listening may know, I teach. Yeah. And recently with my grade 5s, we started talking about government, and the first topic was the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Okay.
And they're having difficulty discerning between what is a right, what is a responsibility. And my example was gun ownership in Canada.
Well, good for you.
That was not my only example.
Good for you.
I used a driver's license.
Don't tell me to listen. I'm trying to pay you a compliment. Good for you, right? You don't hear this that often. I'm gonna tell you flat out. Good for you. Please carry on.
I used the driver's license as another example. Because they were. We're having a discussion about what is a right, and they said that you have a right to drive. I said you don't have a right to drive. You have a right to make the effort to attain your license. It's a privilege to drive.
Yes.
And you have to drive that car responsibly, because they were kind of confusing that as well. You have to drive the car responsibly to retain that privilege of driving a car. There were still some that were foggy, so gun ownership in Canada was my next topic. I said, you're allowed to own a gun in Canada. You don't have a right to own a gun, but you have the right to take the course, demonstrate your proficiency in terms of safety and knowing the laws to attain that license. Now, your ability to practice safe storage and all things safe will allow you the privilege of keeping that license. Keeping that license. And so, I make no bones about it. There's no reason why I shouldn't talk about that.
No, well, you know what? There are some people, I'm sure, that would disagree with you, and they would say that it's too sensitive a subject, perhaps, to talk about with kids. I disagree completely. I think that it's important that they make informed decisions, and it starts at an early age.
Well, I got no phone calls or letters the next day.
That's good. That's good. You know what? I'm happy to hear that. I love the idea of educating our youth, about our past, about our history, about our heritage, and Canada has a strong one connected to firearms. There's a lot of people in this country that can trace back in their family lines, hunters. And when you look at any culture out there, hunters have always been celebrated. And I don't talk about this enough. I appreciate hunters. I appreciate what they do for the environment, what they contribute to the economy of this country. I ask everybody out there that's got a friend who's a hunter, right, to tell them about the page and to let them know that we're doing some good things for the firearm community. And at the same time, I think it's really important that, you've taken the time to discuss this with some today's youth and grab them kind of at an early age and get them to have a better appreciation and understanding of things as they are.
Nobody went screaming from the classroom. Nobody started crying. They understood.
Yeah, well, there is this misconception, certainly among the left, that firearms are only capable of one thing, designed for only one thing. And this subject came up, recently as well. That firearms are only designed to kill people. And and I'm going to get your take on this in a second. But I really got to say this. To all the people out there that rest back on their laurels and say, ultimately, when the argument gets a little bit too hot for them, they say they're only designed for one thing, to kill people. And I disagree. I would say that if there's 20 million firearms out in circulation, and have been for quite some time now, that if they were only designed for one thing, then we would have a very, very large problem we haven't been experiencing.
And how many people die every year from legal use of someone who's legally owned to possess a gun? It's less than 1%.
The numbers are ridiculously low. I mean, and the doctors weighing in on the issue. That's another thing I would discuss with you, but I'm not going to delve into that. That's a whole other podcast.
It's a podcast on its own.
Yeah, well, they're crying. The few doctors that have thrown their weight behind this political issue, and that's what it is, folks. It's not about public safety. For the few doctors that have thrown their weight behind this thing, they're crying foul now because people have called them out and complained that they shouldn't be getting involved in political issues. That despite the fact that they may have some knowledge of the treatment,
because they're highly educated, it means that they're qualified to speak on something.
No, it's it's the trust that the public has in its physicians.
It's marketing 101 is what it is. You put somebody up there, and again, it's another something I use from the classroom. You put somebody up there that is so-called quote unquote expert. You put them in a white lab coat. All of a sudden, people attach credibility to it, whether or not that person is actually credible or knowledgeable or versed on what they're speaking about.
And what, Billy Blair would fall into the same category as the former chief of police of Toronto. To put him in the big man seat and to make him the minister of something.
He's a pawn.
Well, you know what? He's certainly going up there and in the face of all evidence that would suggest otherwise is still pushing the same message, right? That legal firearm ownership needs to be even more severely regulated, and that somehow is going to have an impact on public safety. I am truly ashamed, right, that as the former top cop for Toronto, that he would be manipulated that way.
Does it surprise you?
You know what? I wish I could say it didn't.
It doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm going to use the term sellout.
Oh, yeah. I was about to say, as you were saying that, I'm thinking it's all about lining his pockets.
Well, if in fact that's what he's doing, or if he has some political goals himself, I wouldn't be one bit surprised. But when everybody and their brother is coming to you with information that would lead you to believe the total contrary of what you're pushing, you can draw your conclusions from that. I certainly have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, but back to the kids and talking to the kids, I'd be curious to know, a lot of people discuss this one and it comes up quite often, when's a good age to start talking about guns to kids? Because for those of us out there that have kids and or have exposure to kids, even nieces and nephews and whatnot, when's a good age?
You know what? I think that's I don't know if it's a tough question, but I think it kind of depends on where you're situated.
Yeah.
And because if you're out in Western Canada and you're in rural Western Canada, that's just a way of life. There is no discussion. You are just socialized as you are raised.
Yeah.
Because it's part of the farm life and taking care of varmints, or you go out into the bush and just personal protection. It's through a natural exposure as they're socialized as they grow older, I think, in certain parts of the country. But now you come back to Southern Ontario, that's not necessarily a part of our life in the way it would be in other parts of Canada. But you know what? Maybe it's some people can make the argument it's no different than teaching a kid when to cross the street.
Yeah.
Look both ways. No cars. Okay. Well, now it's safe.
That's the way I see it. I see it from a safety perspective, and you're absolutely right. It has a lot to do with, your environment. If you're out in rural, Western Canada, if you're in areas where, using firearms as an implement, of husbandry, and if it's part of farm living, and, at a very early age, you're going to be taking over the responsibility of putting down animals, whether it be predators that are coming after after your livestock, or putting down animals.
Various
there's a number
uses.
of different things. It's really important that you discuss the subject of safety with the kids and give them a level of exposure that demystifies firearms, because as we all know, when you tell kids not to touch something, that's when they most want it.
Right.
And so that I've always believed that, perhaps this liberal mindset of shielding, children and wrapping them up in bubble wrap and keeping them away from everything that, might harm them really is counterproductive. I don't think that it achieves what it should.
Well, I don't
achieve.
know if it's been counterproductive, because I think all those construction workers are out there building those safe rooms for them to run to.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, no.
Was that out loud? Sorry. I'm on March break, so I can't control my inner outer voice right now.
I love it when you think out loud. No, but I really do believe, though, that it's an important thing, to discuss the subject of firearms with your kids, especially if you have them in the home.
No question.
No
question.
And to make them completely aware of the fact that these are not items that can be handled before, a parent has approved. Right, of them doing.
It's all about your attitude too. Like you have to be stern in terms of it's not a toy. Yeah. Regardless of when you go to Dollarama and you see the little plastic, it's not a toy.
Yeah, and you know what's funny, and I oftentimes I discuss this one with people, but I haven't done it here on the podcast yet. But I noticed that with families that have firearms, tend to be the most respectful families. The kids tend to have a real appreciation. No, they have a real appreciation for the rules.
Old school values.
Well, old school values. And I mean, with things going so shitty these days, and with so many kids with this sense of entitlement they feel, and with the way that they have, behavioral issues, I'll tell you, I don't see that. It seems to be completely absent from the homes that have firearms. And I wonder why that is.
That's a good point. But, again, it's something I see every day at work. It's day one. I tell my kids, and I don't mean to harp about my occupation, but it doesn't cost you anything to say please and thank you.
No, but respect.
But it comes through out of that, right? Common courtesy. It costs you nothing to hold a door.
No,
it costs you nothing.
You know what? And you're right, and that's altogether too often absent from the upbringing of today's kids, I find. But to have kids though exposed at an early age to firearms, I got a good friend. He's still a police officer, and he takes his boy shooting, and he started him at a very early age. And I once saw something that I thought was fantastic. I knew he was going to raise his kid right, and he took him out shooting. And of course he's out there, plinking away with, the new 22, it's going to be his starter single shot bolt action rifle. Yeah. And the boy takes a couple of shots, and everything is done, in accordance with the safety protocol that his father has set out. And of course, he fires his last shot, and, his father looks at him and says, okay, we're going to go check the target, right? You happy with the way that sits? And the kid says, oh yeah, he says, okay, well, let's go check it, right? And he says, yeah, and the kid stands up, and his father stops him and says, what haven't you done? And
cleared the chamber?
And the boy drops his head, right, and says, I didn't clear the gun. And Dad replies, that's right. You know the deal. We're packing up. You're going home.
Right. Done.
Day's over.
Yeah.
Day's over. And you know what? If you raise a kid wrong, he's going to kick, he's going to scream, he's going to be angry, he's going to be disappointed. Of course.
That's fine. We're still going to the car.
Even as a well-behaved child, he's going to be disappointed.
Of course.
But he knows his day is over, and he's learned a valuable lesson that day.
And next time, his ass will be planted on that freaking chair until he clears the damn gun.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, he's never made the same mistake since.
No
surprise.
surprise.
I check in on an ongoing basis to see if he's ever made that mistake since, and they've been out dozens and dozens of times, and it never happens, right? Instilling a good sense of safety in these kids is really important. I don't think that there's ever an age early enough that you can discuss with your child, right, the importance of how using firearms safely is. And so go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, think about when you were taught to drive. Right? Like you're sitting there getting taught how to shoot a gun. That adult or that person that's teaching you is right. They're not over having a smoke and a coffee in the parking lot. So they're right beside you, right? Teaching, and if anything goes wrong, they can grab that gun.
I kind of learned on 100 acres of farm.
You're not helping my argument right now. versus.
It was a tractor. You don't need a license for a tractor.
No, I was going to. No, you don't. But versus being taught how to drive a car, you're the one behind that wheel. Yeah. Something happens. That's a 3,000-pound piece of machinery that could do some damage as well.
Yeah, I had some pretty harsh lessons growing up as a child regarding my operation of a car. the CGV has always had kind of a heavy foot. If we crept 10 kilometers an hour over the posted limit, my father let me know immediately.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. It was a different time during the 80s, folks.
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was. Anyway, that's about all the time we have for today's episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And as always, Canada, don't forget to shoot straight, stay safe.